Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Yesterday, I had an experience that led me to doing today's video, and I was at my local Fleet Farm, which for those of you that are not familiar with Fleet Farm, it's a chain that's a hardware store, but also has like all the fishing stuff you could ever imagine, all the hunting stuff. They're a fantastic Wisconsin / Minnesota store. And while I was there, I ran into the wife of a friend of mine who is looking to purchase a fishing rod for her husband. And she wanted my help, and I quickly found that I wasn't necessarily going to be able to give her the help that she wanted because she didn't know what she was looking for in terms of a rod. And what I mean by that is I started asking her a bunch of questions like, do you know what type of rod he's looking for from a technique standpoint? Is it a Carolina rig rod, a topwater, a spinnerbait, a jig? Do you know what lures he likes to fish? And unfortunately, she just didn't know. So I really wasn't all that helpful in terms of helping her purchase a rod. We did pick one out. We just picked one out that would be a good all-around all-purpose rod. It was the one that she bought was a 7.2 medium heavy fast action rod. Just a good all-purpose rod. The interesting thing, or what was clearly evident to me, is how often I think, this is probably something that happens on a regular basis where anglers are going out and purchasing rods, but they're not really sure what they're looking for. Or other people are purchasing rods for the anglers and they're just not familiar enough as to what those anglers like to do, which then leads to there being some issues with respect to potentially purchasing the correct rod. To make a long story short, what I wanted to talk about today was just some general information with respect to choosing the correct rod, because as you know, I like to build my own rods. This is a new MHX blank that I'm going to build, and really what building my own rods has allowed me to do is fine-tune what I expect and what I want out of rods for specific lures or techniques that I'm fishing. And I feel like it's given me a very unique feel as to, what type of rods you're looking for. So what I wanted to do is just give some very general information as to how to choose the correct rod, because I think this is something that a lot of anglers, especially if you're more novice, you're a beginner, you don't really think about. So I think for the most part, what a lot of people have or think of when they go to purchase a rod is they look at a few things like your rod length and the speed or action of the rod. And I think that generally there's a consensus out there that the longer the rod, the better. The faster the action the rod is, the more sensitive it is, which makes it a better rod overall. And that's not necessarily the case. It really is very dependent on what it is that you're looking to do with that rod. So if we were to talk about just the overall length of the rod blank itself, you need to recognize that that length is going to do some things positively and negatively in terms of your fishing. So overall, a longer rod right off the bat gives you longer casting distance. The rod loads up better, you can throw baits further. But having said that, generally you're less accurate with a longer rod because they're harder to control. And if you're casting longer distances, your accuracy is probably going to be off a little bit the further you're casting. So just because you're casting further isn't necessarily a good thing if your accuracy is off. Now, having said that, it comes down to where you're fishing too, right? Like if you're a shore fisherman and you want to be casting as far as you can, longer rods help with that. That's one reason why you see inshore fishermen that are fishing on beaches with like 10-foot rods so that they can catapult their baits a quarter mile off the bank. But if you're a kayak fisherman, longer rods generally are a hindrance. Same thing with a bank fisherman. If you're a bank fisherman and you're fishing around rivers where you're fishing around a ton of overhanging trees and bushes, longer rods can be a major hindrance from that standpoint. So if you are one of those anglers, you probably should just recognize the fact that, if you're fishing in a kayak, longer rods aren't necessarily a good thing for you. The other thing to keep in mind when working a longer rod versus a shorter rod is you generally move your bait much further without really recognizing it with your longer rods. Meaning when you sweep a longer rod, that bait moves further. Depending on the technique that you're fishing, that length may not be a good thing. So for example, if I'm fishing a hollow belly frog, or a topwater bait, I generally prefer a shorter rod because every time I twitch it to get it to walk the dog, because I'm using a shorter rod, I'm actually moving it less. So I'm getting it to walk the dog in place and stay in that specific strike zone longer. Now, in some instances, I want a long rod. You know, if I'm flipping heavy mats with a heavy weight, I want a longer rod to really try to get those fish out of those mats. It gives me more leverage. So it's again, the length of the rod is really determined by the technique that you're fishing and the style that you're fishing and the locations that you're fishing. So just keep that in mind when choosing a rod. Longer is not generally always better. And then you've got the other instances like storage. Like for me, I don't necessarily like having long rods in my basement here because my basement's only a little over 7 feet and most of my rods hit the ceiling. So from a storage standpoint, it's not ideal, which is why I use a curtain rack on my ceiling, as you guys can see it up there. That's what I use to store my rods, which works really well, but I do that specifically because I can't have them lined up against the wall. So you got to keep those things in mind. Another thing that I'm always looking at, or I should say I hear a lot from anglers, is that the more sensitive the rod, the better it is. Well, again, it kind of comes down to the technique that you're fishing. Generally speaking, the more sensitive the rod, the faster the action. I am not a fan of extra fast rods. I think they do more hindrance than good. Now, you generally do feel, have much better feel with extra fast rods because they tend to be more sensitive. Even though that's not always the case, but that usually is the case. I generally prefer to throw a fast action rod if I'm using a slow moving bait. So maybe I'm throwing jigs, maybe I'm throwing a wacky rig, things like that, where I really am working the bait slower. I don't have as much direct connection to the bait and I'm just trying to feel for those bites. A sensitive rod really helps in those situations. Now, having said that, say you're throwing a crankbait or a lipless crankbait or a topwater bait. Generally speaking, a slower action rod, so more of a moderate speed or a moderate fast rod, will allow you to still get the hook driven home, but you're not going to feel that bite so fast where you're pulling the hooks away. Generally speaking, I'm going to be using that with my moving baits that have exposed hooks, like treble hooks on a crankbait. You know, at that point, I want the fish to be able to suck that bait in, and a softer tip rod, a moderate speed rod, is going to allow that bait to pull into the fish's mouth better. You generally get better hookups. And more importantly, when fighting the fish, you actually lose less fish because the rod absorbs a lot more of that fish's fight versus the rod tip pulling, really reefing on the hooks, which tends to pull treble hooks out of the fish's mouth. So depending on the technique that I'm fishing, I like a fast action rod for usually my slower moving presentations. And I like a more of a moderate speed rod for things like vibrating jigs and crankbaits where I'm casting and winding. Swim baits is the same way. If it's an exposed hook, as something that is like this rod, which is a blended rod, this is a CB906 by MHX, that's a blended rod. So I've got backbone to about here and then a much softer tip going out to the end. So when I set the hook, I can drive the hook home, but there's a lot of play in that rod tip. So when you're looking at rods, don't just go, oh, I need an extra fast rod or a fast action rod. You want to try to pair it more with the techniques that you're fishing. Now, I realize a lot of anglers don't have the ability to have the number of rods that I have. So I can have rods more for specific techniques, but it is something to be cognizant of next time you go out. Like in my opinion, if I only had 3 rods, I would have one rod that's probably a 7.3 fast action rod that's more of an all-purpose rod. I'd have a blended rod, which is more for your moving baits with exposed hooks. And I'd probably have a spinning rod at that point for my finesse tactics. But as you add rods to the arsenal, you want to try to pair up those new rods with the techniques that maybe you're trying to get better at or techniques that you really like, and you usually have more than one rod paired up for. So from that standpoint, the last thing to mention, I guess, and I kind of touch base on this, is the material that the rod's made out of. Most of your rods these days are graphite rods. those rods tend to have faster action builds on it. If you're looking for more of your moderate speeds or a slower action speed, that's where your blended composite rods come into play, and that's where your fiberglass rods come in. Fiberglass rods, some of them are just like straight up whipsticks where, if you're trying to set the hook with a jig, you're just not going to do it, because when you set the hook, you absorb all of that hook set in the rod versus driving the hook point home in the fish's mouth. So it's something to be aware of. I feel like I just spewed a lot of information at you. It's not that difficult. It's really a matter of taking the techniques that you like to fish and trying to match those rods up appropriately. And right now, this is a shameless plug for my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link that just popped in my head. I got an email yesterday also saying that the Black Friday sale was already in place at Tackle Warehouse, and I know they have a lot of rods on sale. So if you are looking to purchase a rod, hopefully these tips helped you. And if you want to support the channel, you can use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. I'll put the link in the video description for you. But it's something that I see on a regular basis where anglers or individuals that are buying rods for anglers, I don't really know the rods that it is that they're looking for. And there's a lot of different characteristics that go into choosing the correct rod for that specific angler. Hopefully this was helpful. I feel like I jumbled all over the place on this, but I think it makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in the comment section and I can do some clarifying. I can answer the questions that you have. So thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.